Hi.
Hi.
Guess where we're going to start?
I think it begins with a T.
This is correct.
Tim Pawlenti.
This is correct.
Tim Pawlenti, exactly.
Zephyr Teachout. No. But let's start. We really do have to start, I think, because the events of the last 48 hours or 72 hours have put this already bizarre campaign into a whole new perspective. The first question is, has what we saw this weekend, the disruption, the threats, violence on occasion, has this been brewing for some time?
I think so. It's funny, I remember at the end of last year watching Trump rallies, and then as we were getting toward Iowa, going to them, and I was very struck at how calm the crowds were, especially because Trump uses the media as a device at every single rally. He will point to the back of the room and he'll say, those are the most dishonest people in the world. It will sometimes result in people turning around and booing or hissing at reporters. But generally speaking, people have been pretty calm. There was an incident last year where a Black Lives Matter protester was kicked and punched at one of his rallies. And the next day, Trump said maybe he deserved to get roughed up. And he got a lot of criticism for that. So his rallies started including a disclaimer about, please don't touch the protesters. He has become more aggressive in his language. I noticed the shift after he won New Hampshire. He, in the lead up to the Nevada caucuses, was at a rally. A protester was taken out. According to Trump, this protester was throwing punches. No one in the crowd recalled seeing that, by all accounts. And Trump said from the podium, I'd like to punch that guy in the face. Has then at other points said, lamented the good old days when people would be, quote unquote, taken out on a stretcher. So yes, I would say this was coming for some time.
You have been out and about at his rallies. Is that your sense too? This morning on Fox News, Chris Wallace directly said to Donald Trump, you have been encouraging violence at rally after rally. I say that in case we get questions, how come the media never calls Trump out? Is that a fair assessment that Chris Wallace said? Has he, in fact, in some way or another, been encouraging or feeding an appetite that he called violence?
I don't think there's any question about it. That the way he has talked about sort of the people at his rallies who are not, one of us, not one of my people, I've never heard a candidate speak like that. It's all well and good to sort of engage with hecklers in a combative way that, candidates like Chris Christie and even Mitt Romney have sort of, gotten into it on occasion, but never with the kind of language of, I would like to see physical harm done to that person. I will say, I went to a number of Trump rallies, especially during the New Hampshire primary, and many of them were actually fairly dull. And so I think what we're seeing this weekend, it's been brewing for a while, but it's definitely reached a new pitch, that it's not like this has been happening all along and we're only now just really paying attention to it.
I agree with that.
And indeed, it should be pointed out that his Republican opponents have called him out on this. Rubio, Cruz has said violence, this rhetoric is feeding violence. They've also attacked the protesters and they've attacked Obama. But my point about this, and you have a expression of, I don't think you're right. Why don't you tell me why I'm not right?
Because
young punk.
I'll get off your lawn after I'm done answering this question. And boy, am I not young.
Yeah.
Because while I agree that his opponents all criticized him uniformly this weekend, there are 3 opponents left. Once upon a time, this was a 17-person primary.
No argument.
No, but what I'm saying is that his rhetoric has been heading in a certain direction for a while. I agree with Alex that a lot of the rallies were not at this kind of a pitch, but that punch him in the face remark that I just mentioned was February 23rd. We are now pretty deep into March. There is no reason that it had to wait until this weekend.
But fair point. But this is what is so puzzling me, and in fact, it's puzzled me about Trump almost from the beginning. He's closer to the nomination now than he ever was. And you would think, and in fact, I think at the debate he was trying to appear less combative, less twitchy, more, to use the wretched word, presidential. And yet there seems to be something about this guy that is the opposite of what almost anybody else would do. Rather than saying, okay, now I might well be the nominee, I better you're telling me that he's ratcheting it up. Why? What does that tell you?
I think it tells you first that he really is new to this, right? That he doesn't have the instincts that a person, even a combative politician like Chris Christie would have, knowing that there are times where the most powerful thing you can do is to sort of rise above the fray, and sometimes pulling a punch is the right thing to do. I think it's also revealing of sort of Trump's underlying political worldview, that he tends to see everything, and you can hear it in his speeches, he tends to see everything in terms of strength and weakness. And that's, if you see the entire world through that binary, it doesn't really create a lot of space for taking the high road or sort of rising above the situation. Just think about, in that debate on Thursday, if he had, when he was challenged on the violence at his rallies, if he had delivered a really, really stern statement saying this is completely unacceptable, I've never intended to do that, and if I did, I sincerely apologize, we would have been knocked out.
Right, but there you are, because that leads right to my next point. Have you ever heard him say, I think I was wrong about this?
He has, but certainly not about that. And I'm casting my memory to try to remember exactly what it was. I think I've heard him say, I made a mistake maybe once. And that's not just once in this campaign, but that's really once in 20 years of covering him. So he was asked a question. I was really struck by this. Two things happened on the lead up to us coming on stage. One was he did 3 events today, and one of them in the middle of the day in Cincinnati was essentially a town hall. And it was very striking because there was clearly a remove from the crowd. There was somebody who rushed the stage on yesterday morning, also in Ohio. So he's being a little more pulled back, but he was asked a question by a woman, which was, if you become president, I think Native Americans have been treated terribly in this country. Would you, as president, apologize? And his response to Alex's point about being new at this was, I'm not so big on apologies, in case you haven't noticed that, which would be unheard of from almost anyone. The second point was, as we were coming on stage, he's doing a rally right now in Florida. There are people at the rally who are screaming about Clinton, which is often a staple of his rallies, and not surprising, given that she's still expected to be the Democratic nominee, but someone in the crowd yelled, give her the guillotine or something like that. Like, that is this increasing of this language that we're seeing. So he doesn't think that he's doing anything wrong, number one. And number two, he says to me, whenever I talk to him, that he loves to not read from a prepared text because he likes making eye contact with people in the audience. So at a debate hall, he's not feeding off of the crowd in the same way. And the crowds, for many weeks, these debates have been against him. And he's used that to great effect. But at his own rallies, I think he gets very charged.
What's interesting on the point about reading from a prepared text, my wife, who's a political reporter from CNN who covers Trump, noticed that at his rallies yesterday he did bring printed notes up to the podium. So I don't know that we can read anything particular into that, but certainly maybe an effort to be a little bit more cautious. I think he gets that this is an extraordinarily dangerous moment in his campaign. Yes. And he doesn't necessarily have the instincts and the skill set to navigate that really confidently.
Or, to another point, the people around him to tell him what he should be doing.
But this is what's part of what makes this so astonishing. That is, okay, you're a successful or allegedly successful businessman, and you're thinking about running for president. And you've been thinking about this according to a piece that you guys wrote. This has been a long time in the making. Now, everybody else that I can think of who's thought about running for president and lacks certain knowledge or skills, they'll go to the Hoover Institute and they'll get briefed by the foreign policy experts. They'll convene a bunch of people in and say, what are our tax policies should be? Might get the sense that Donald Trump simply said, I'm going to run for president. As he said to Chuck Todd, I'll get my foreign policy and intelligence used by watching television shows and hearing the generals. I will say whatever comes into my mind, no matter how at variance it is, and I'll win. And so far, he has. What up with that?
Gonna get back on your lawn now.
No, it strikes me that that's the most singularly amazing thing about this.
Yeah, he's not. He's. I mean, we've I literally get tongue-tied when I think about where we are right now, but. Nobody took him seriously. I remember somebody in his campaign called me in May of last year and said, Trump is going to announce next month and we want you to break the news. And I said, no. And they said, what do you mean no? And I said, I am not writing a thing about this until he actually says I'm running, because we went through all of this in 2011. I think that there is an enormous, the 5-borough version of Trump that we all see and have known for a long time is not what the rest of the country sees. He's been beamed into their living rooms, at a big table for a very, very long time, sitting in a leather chair, looking, leaderly,
looking like a
not
leader.
presidential, but saying you're fired, and that is an act that has worked for him.
Just if I may,
Yeah.
Our audience is way too above this. She's talking about The Apprentice.
Who among us didn't?
Yeah.
No.
No, but it's important to note that he was probably way better known than any other candidate for president, and better known as a leader who makes decisions.
He said, better known as a leader who makes decisions. The Trump brand was very different than I think the Trump reality as we know it here. And he had a tremendous command of the media microphone, particularly cable news. So he's not, a Republican pollster said to me that he's literally the only candidate this person knows, and even pre-candidate, who was allowed to not just go on Fox News whenever he wanted, but to call in, as opposed to wandering over to the studio that's like 5 blocks from his house. So he has been able to do things that other candidates couldn't do. He was entertaining. People treated it as a show. And I think that it is, you can't understate the degree to which voters in both parties, but certainly within the Republican base, are incredibly angry, not just at Washington, but at their political leaders. They feel completely ignored for many years now.
And the second part about that, of the what's up with this, is I can think of a dozen, you can probably think of many more times when any other candidate would have been blown out of this race for good, starting with his assault on John McCain, his comment about Megyn Kelly, his comment about Mexicans, his mocking of Ben Carson as the child molesting knife wielder. And
You mean the man who endorsed him the other day?
yes, the man
Right.
who endorsed him the other day, exactly.
To be clear, he didn't say he was a child molester. He said he was like a child molester.
And that is a distinction he would make
Similar
to
to
say
a child
to you.
molester.
Difference between a simile and a metaphor, I guess. Thank you. That's extremely helpful. But what I'm getting at, and I think it's to Maggie's point, is that there's a way larger cohort than almost anybody realized. And people, not this, we always hear about discontent, they're angry, they're disaffected. These voters are so alienated that even the mechanisms that usually tell them when a candidate has gone beyond the pale, it's not that they don't hear it, it's that they don't say, you're part of the problem.
Well, I mean, to sort of lay out a political reporter's gripe here in answering your question, this is what happens when a political party spends years and years telling its voters, do not trust the media. They are all a bunch of liars.
Bingo.
They invent stuff about our candidates. They can't be trusted. We have to have a whole debate schedule designed to shield our candidates from the media. And, far be it from, I think, anyone up here to claim that the media is perfect, but when you've cut down all the neutral, or at least aspirationally neutral arbiters of what's in bounds and what's out of bounds and what's true and what's not, then guess what? You end up with 30 to 40% of your party that simply does not believe negative information. Going to these Trump events, you ask people, are you troubled by, X thing that he said? No, the media is blowing that out of proportion. They will bring up proactively before you raise it. By the way, all that stuff about his bankruptcies is totally false. He used it like everybody else uses it, right? And there is this kind of inside and outside dynamic in terms of how you perceive Trump, that if you're bought in, external information is really irrelevant to you.
Now, you've got a lot of people left and right. Charles Murray wrote, I thought, a brilliant piece in the Wall Street Journal about how Trump's voters have been screwed by elites of every kind. The economic elites, media, they've been condescended to, they've been brushed aside. Peggy Noonan talked about the protected and the unprotected. You have Thomas Frank, a pretty well-known person from the left, making the same argument, that these folks have been screwed over for so long. But there's a second dimension to this, which is beyond the economic grievances. How much of what you've heard about the Trump supporters is something else? Call it nativist, call it anti-immigrant, call it racist. Whatever it is, how much of the anger that's fueling Trump is due less to economic stuff and more to the cultural sense that our world is being taken away from us. Those people have now, ascended to dominant positions, and our people are being left behind.
I think that there's an overwhelming component of this sort of fear of cultural displacement, that some of our colleagues had this great piece over the weekend about sort of what demographic characteristics are most likely to predict support for Donald Trump. And one of the big ones was people who write on their census forms that they are American when they're asked what their sort of ethnic background is. Like, I'm not going to play your games about, I'm a Jewish American or Indian American or whatever. I'm American. And I do think there is this sense of real sort of nationalism that drives a lot of what he does. And I would say just to I thought that the Murray and Frank pieces were really sharp. A lot of people have been screwed economically across the political spectrum, and you don't see this dynamic manifest everywhere. And you don't see it manifest everywhere even within the Republican Party. You don't see suburban folks who got their home foreclosed in the crisis and lost their job at a big law firm. You don't really see them showing up at Trump rallies in the same way.
Not like that. No, I think Alex is exactly right. I think that it is a huge component of it. There is, and it is part of the us and them mentality that Trump often talks about and espouses. I do think that the racism aspect of it is a touchy one because as I think most of my colleagues are very loath to paint anyone's supporters or anyone in particular with a broad brush. But I would say that the number of people at his rallies who have spoken about President Obama in really deeply vitriolic terms, to me, has been pretty jarring. And if you want to look at, and we wrote about this today, if there is somebody who louder than anybody in the 2012 election sort of, held up, it questioned Obama's legitimacy, it was Donald Trump with the birther stuff, which, you'll notice that is the one thing I would say, if for somebody who's not known for tremendous restraint in this campaign, that's something that he has really refrained from talking about. He is aware that it was not good for him. He is aware that it is problematic, very problematic in a general election. But I just think that you can't sort of spend your time saying this person is actually Kenyan and not expect it to have some ramifications with voters.
So now I want to look at the Republican Party more broadly. And a couple of months ago, I talked to a number of what the Trump people would call rhinos or worse. But they're conservatives, but they've held mainstream Republican positions. They've been party officials. And they were talking then, and I think they're still talking now. They will not vote for this guy. They want a third party, somebody like a Mitt Romney or a Ben Sasse from Nebraska, some conservative that they can rally to, but they will not vote for him. Then you've got these other folks, and I'm not talking about the job seekers. I'm not talking about Ben Carson or Chris Christie. I'm talking about a guy like Hugh Hewitt, a very, I think, respected conservative commentator who says you have to vote for whoever the Republican is, no matter what, because otherwise we lose the Supreme Court for a generation. Where do you see, how powerful do you see this debate playing out should Trump wind up as the nominee? I mean, do you think there will be a serious set of Republicans and conservatives who will defect on the grounds, this guy's just not fit to be president, we're willing to lose?
I do, and I think you're already seeing some of it. I mean, I think that in this weird moment where, Mitt Romney is sort of playing a version of George Romney without actually running, and if you want to maintain the 1968 parallel, I think Romney is going to do his best to keep talking about this and tell people that this would be devastating and that you have to essentially burn the village to save it. I think you're going to get donors you will have some donors who will fall in line with Trump. You will have many other donors who will not. You will have many other donors who, even if they don't actively do anything to stop Trump, will choose not to do anything negative against Hillary Clinton. And then I think you will see an effort to put somebody serious on a third-party ballot in some way. I mean, who can...
Which they better get moving on, considering the filing deadline.
There's time.
And an interesting sort of scenario, and I'm not predicting this, but when we think about third-party campaigns, we think about ballot access because that's what you would need in order to be viable. But the folks on the right who are saying they will never vote for Trump, even at the cost of the election, they're not concerned about mounting a viable campaign. They're concerned about putting someone out there who can sort of maintain the intellectual integrity of conservatism in America. And under those circumstances, and in the media environment we're in, it's totally conceivable, actually, that over the summer there would be a right-in Mitt Romney campaign that could get 10% of the vote, right? And it would be unprecedented, like a lot of things.
That's a very significant point. I mean, it is true that every once in a while things like that happen. Lisa Murkowski got elected to the Senate from Alaska on a write-in. So just, I'm not going to have you take us through the intricacies of the Republican convention because we would be here till Wednesday. There are two very good pieces, if you care. One by Ben Ginsberg, a longtime Republican lawyer that was in Politico. One on Slate, which is a wonderful piece, taking you almost minute by minute through what would happen. But are we going to know a whole lot more in 48 hours and change whether, in fact, Trump is stoppable or not?
If Trump wins both Ohio and Florida, then I think the chances that Trump is stoppable are quite slim. That having been said, all of this requires a rewriting of the rules of the convention. This will be every party convention, there is a rules committee meeting beforehand, and they rewrite some version of the rules, they reissue some version of the rules. In 2012, Ben Ginsberg, author of that wonderful piece, was Mitt Romney's lawyer. Right. And he slipped into the rules something about how you had to win a majority of the delegates of a state in at least 8 states in order to be nominated. We're looking at a scenario where there might only be one person who meets that. So there is no possibility for somebody right now to be nominated from the floor. There's no great options either way for Republicans.
What I'm, well, I live for stuff like this, right? and this is way beyond my imagination. I fiddle with the idea of an open convention book, but not close did I come up with this. So, the idea is sitting there with your cutout from the New York Times on they always print first ballot, second ballot, third ballot, which hasn't happened since 1956 for the vice president. This may be the time. So shall we turn to the Democrats? Another confession. If you had told me 7 months ago that a 74-year-old Jewish socialist
but he's from Brooklyn,
who does a pretty good imitation of Larry David, and somebody that my parents knew 100-fold over, right? Always good for an argument at the dinner table. I know he has the Weavers of Carnegie Hall album somewhere in his house. But if you had told me that this person would be managing a credible campaign to the heir to a pretty successful political figure, I would have said, come on, you're crazy. So, is this is a cable news kind of question. How much of this is Bernie Sanders and how much of it is a dissatisfaction with Hillary Clinton?
I think a lot of it is dissatisfaction with Hillary Clinton. I think that what is always striking when everybody talks about this matchup of the 74-year-old Democratic Socialist versus Hillary Clinton is just 74, and yet he is winning overwhelmingly with younger voters. Right. And that has been very surprising to Hillary Clinton and to her husband. And disappointing to them. She genuinely believed, and you saw this in New Hampshire in the final days of the primary, where you had her surrogates, particularly Madeleine Albright, using a very famous line that Madeleine Albright has used for many, many years about how there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women, but she used it in the context of, and go vote for Hillary, everybody, and it did not go over very well. Hillary Clinton thinks that this makes her new, and that this gives a newness to her campaign, and it clearly would, just objectively, to have a first female Democratic nominee, but younger women in particular, but younger voters in general, aren't seeing it that way.
Now, to some extent, you mentioned the fact that the Republicans have been telling their people for years, don't trust the media. If we flip the coin, the argument about inequality and Wall Street greed has been a far more prevalent argument among Democrats and liberals, and certainly in the days of Bill Clinton and his move to the center and his courting of Wall Street. So to what extent is Bernie Sanders inheriting or brilliantly speaking to a feeling that has certainly been growing since the financial meltdown of 2008?
I think in a lot of ways, Sanders represents a sort of long deferred version on the left of what the Republicans worked through in their primaries in 2010, 2012, 2014, where you had, in 2010, I remember covering a couple of governor's races, Senate races, where there was a clear front runner who just went up in smoke because they had been supportive of the bailout. And Democrats have not really had the chance to vent like that the way Republicans did over time. Republicans are clearly not done venting, but you did have this weird spectacle for a number of years where the left party in the country was sort of lockstep behind a president who was asking everybody to just take it down a notch when it comes to being mad at the financial sector. And so you could see that the demand, you could imagine the demand being there for a long time. I do think the generational aspect of this is really striking, and I do wonder if it heralds some kind of underlying change in the way young people have been sort of habituated to vote. That there's, you know, this kind of 90% support in some states for a guy who, when you look at sort of the full range of issues on the table here, he talks about a really, really narrow set of them.
This is the part, again, that it's one of the many, many things that has left me kind of blinking in the sun. They're waiting to be turned into fossilized fuel, which is, you know, most candidates, even if they have a theme, they have variations on a theme. But my sense about Sanders is, if you, in the middle of a debate, if the moderator said the hall is on fire, Sanders would say, that's because the greedy contractors with their millionaires and billionaires didn't have fire safety regulations.
Right.
He seems incapable of saying anything else under any circumstances, and yet, you know, he's hit a chord.
We're in a weird moment where Hillary Clinton is well ahead on delegates, both committed delegates and then the super delegates, which are this weirdness of the Democratic Party where you're an elected official or a member of the party or something and you can choose who to be with. But she's also poised in the range of states that are coming up to not do particularly well, and her campaign has made that clear. So you have this odd track where she is moving toward getting the nomination, and yet she's running against someone, as you say, who has this one message, and has not shown much of an interest in adapting to seem better on foreign policy. His answers continue to be sort of fairly one note. He, as you said, he always brings it back to income inequality. He always brings it back to Wall Street. What is striking to me about Bernie Sanders, to your question, is there's been this, I think, mythologizing of him as this ingenue who just sort of never thought this was going to get this far. And I think it's true that he never thought it was going to get this far, but he's been doing this for 30 years. It's not like he's new to the political scene.
Right.
And he's also not this disinterested party who doesn't want to get sullied by negativity, which is what his folks were saying for a very long time. He's a pretty adept wielder of the political blade, and he has gotten much better in these debates against her. He was quite good the other night.
I thought
and people aren't ready for it to end, I think, is the bottom line.
I thought what it turns out he's doing in Illinois speaks directly to your point. That is, he is very weak with the African-American community. And what he's doing in Illinois is running ads going hard at Mayor Rahm Emanuel,
Yes.
Who is extremely unpopular in the black community and who happens to be a longtime ally of the Clintons. Yes. So maybe that's...
Except, of course, they started running it like 2 days ago. So if they wanted to be effective, that would have been many weeks ago, to the point about how everything with Sanders is sort of, we'll see how far we get this week, but I think you're right.
You alluded to this, Maggie, but it goes to the point you're making generationally. I know I mentioned this to you because I've written about this. I think Hillary Clinton was genuinely shocked that she could be considered an establishment candidate. She said that in a debate. She said, how can I possibly be the establishment when I'd be the first woman president? Which would be a really good argument around 1986. But it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, first of all, you can't be an establishment and be a woman, right? Queen Elizabeth, call your office. But beyond that, you know, I still think she pictures herself as the Children's Defense Fund, going to Alabama, fighting against the war, working for McGovern, and doesn't seem to understand that, you know, inevitably, in this case, really no fault of her own, but just how she's lived the last 25 years, of course she's a member of the establishment. And in another year, that would be an argument in her favor. Look at her experience. Look at her record.
And you know, to be honest, I'm not entirely convinced that it can't be an effective argument this year. You just need to make it about something other than, I've been at this for so long, give me a promotion, right? That look, there's clearly a segment of the Democratic Party that cares to the exclusion of everything else about bashing Wall Street and campaign finance, right? These are core Democratic topics, but most Democrats care about other things as well. I think the Clinton folks, I think like a lot of people in the media and a lot of people, frankly, on the Republican side, have kind of expected public events to nudge voters in a more, more in the direction of using the typical tests you would use to select a commander-in-chief. That after the attacks in Paris, we all thought, the Clinton campaign certainly thought, Sanders is toast. The people are going to choose a national security leader now. And they didn't necessarily do an awful lot to convince voters that that's what they needed to do. They kind of expected the contrast to present itself. Republicans did the same thing with Trump. They thought that the death of Justice Scalia would, now everybody's really going to get serious. And it didn't, because you didn't persuade them to.
Well, it's also, to your point about how she sees herself, one of the gaffes that she made, and I think Alex and I were both similarly driven nuts by the obsession over gaffes in 2012, most of which had absolutely nothing to do with what ultimately happened, such as "you didn't build that" by President Obama, which meant nothing, but the Romney campaign spent months and months and months on it. But something Clinton said that did stick, and I think you will hear about again in the fall, was when she described herself as dead broke,
Yes.
when she was on her book
Yeah.
tour. But what she was referring to when she said it was the legal fees that she and her husband paid because of myriad investigations, most of which they objected to strenuously, and which didn't really yield much. But in her mind, she thinks everybody knows this. There is a preserved in amber quality to this. She's saying this with a whole new generation that has no memory of this. They don't remember Lewinsky. They don't remember Whitewater. They don't remember any of this. And
Right.
so there's two aspects of that. One is how she sees herself, which is still in the past, and the other is she cannot stop talking about that past. So there was a weird moment the other night in the Democratic debate where she was criticizing, Sanders was talking about the crime bill from the 90s, and he was criticizing her husband. And she said, well, I just can't believe we're going to sit here and talk about the 90s all night. And I thought, she talks about the 90s constantly. And one of the chief critiques of her is that she will not present something forward-looking, to Alex's point. So there is a persuasion argument she can make, but she is often not making it.
Let's talk about the trust thing. It has now brought up endlessly that not Republicans, as Karen Tumulty quite accurately pointed out, but the country
Yes.
regards her in heavy numbers as not honest and trustworthy. And among people in the Democratic primary who care about that, she is losing by 9 and 10 to 1.
That's pretty
I
bad.
think her defenders will say she's being measured by an unfair double standard. Everybody changes their views. A lot of it is just the endless, right-wing noise. Would you like to weigh in on to what extent you think she's kidding herself? To what extent she's right?
Well, look, just to get to the sort of back to the 90s dimension to the campaign, I think for a lot of people, even just the spectacle of hearing, once again, the sort of extended Clinton political family on it every day about how they're victims and how they're being treated unfairly, this brings back some memories for probably some people here that are not entirely pleasant, right? And I don't know that Sanders is the right man ultimately to say, let's turn the page, the way Obama clearly managed to make his case in 2008. But this is also one of the reasons why she would be incredibly fortunate to face Donald Trump in a general election, because if she is seen by a problematic share of the country as sort of slippery, politics as usual, a Washington insider, a pretty good contrast for her would be politics as usual versus whatever the heck this new thing is.
Yeah, but it's also it's the thing you didn't mention in the things that you were mentioning about slippery and changing positions and so forth. What has hurt her enormously with her honest and trustworthy numbers is the email issue. The email issue.
Yeah, I did want to ask you where you think that's going.
I don't know where I think it's going, but in terms of the legality of it, but I don't think that it's ever helpful when you're a political candidate and one of your former aides is being given immunity by the Justice Department, right?
I think that's a pretty shrewd
say that.
judgment. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know where it goes, but it's very difficult for her to
Well,
answer.
I'll offer you one possibility of why she may be held to a different standard, because this struck me when I was going back in her statements. Now, every politician, when it was unpopular, virtually every politician, said, I think marriage is between a man and a woman. And they all evolved, I mean, to use that wonderful word. What Clinton said on the floor of the U.S. Senate was that she regarded marriage as a sacred bond between a man and a woman that was, I'm paraphrasing now, but essential throughout civilization as how we develop. So it was the very intensity of that statement, not like, yeah, it's between a man and a woman, but boy, God, this is a foundational point of civilization that makes the, quote, evolution a little suspicious. When she voted for the authorization of force in Iraq, she was the only Democrat, with the possible exception of Lieberman, and even he was a little shaky about this, who said, Saddam Hussein has ties to Al-Qaeda. And so I'm wondering whether to some extent she is her own worst enemy when it comes to how she phrases her positions that make a change in position look so much more damaging.
I think that the gay marriage evolution, I think that the country has so shifted in the general election electorate on that issue that I think that is actually not something that weighs her down in a huge way. I do think that she has, particularly running against Bernie Sanders, who was so against the Iraq War and clearly against it, I do think that's problematic for her. But I think that I actually think there is a more fundamental and reductionist issue in terms of her problem, which is just I think that she is fundamentally she has some enormous political gifts. She has some enormous talents in general, but I think that she is just fundamentally not a great presidential candidate. I think that the versions of the presidential candidate that we have seen with her are vastly different than what we saw with the 2000 Senate race that she ran. And I think she began this race having had, I think she has enormous scars from the 2008 race. The field was cleared completely of any elected Democrat. I mean, this was unprecedented in recent memory. Who could challenge her, and yet, to your point, she's now running this ridiculous race against Sanders that feels like it's never going to end. In her mind, that's how she sees it. But she made a decision, which was that she was not going to deal with the press. She was going to sort of run the kind of race she wanted to run. She until the last 2 months, did very few interviews. She has still not done a major newspaper sit-down. I think if the Hillary Clinton of 2008 thought she could run this way with the media, she would have done it in a heartbeat. But I think that when you sort of have certain guards up, I think it becomes problematic in how you communicate in general.
Well, and this is one of the sort of broader things that we've seen in this election is, one of the reasons why Trump gets away with the things he gets away with is that as soon as he sort of steps on one landmine, he's sort of on to the next one, right? And he the instinct for a conventional politician, and I don't use that as a pejorative term, but for a conventional politician is, I screwed up, I'm going to go into my bunker now, right? And I'm not going to do any press for as long as it takes for those jackals out there to forget about it, to mix metaphors a little bit. But Trump's attitude is, I just screwed up big, let me give him something else, right? And I do think, someone like Clinton may simply not be built to operate that way.
I think that's right.
But we are sort of headed into a world where I think presidential candidates simply are going to have to be sort of an open book all the time.
I agree with
I'm
that.
sorry. Does this indict the press? Is the fact that Trump has got, I hear this all the time, and I'm not saying that means it's not right, but that the fact that Trump has gotten where he is because the press fell down on the job. They did not call him out. They did not define him as a failed businessman, a con artist, guy who would flunk a 6th grade civics test, whatever the standard is, that they didn't do this. Do you think that's a fair assessment? I know that's a broad brush.
No, I think look, I think we're all going to have to do the sort of media postmortem on sort of where we all fell down, but it's simply not true that the press didn't vet Donald Trump. The Times was looking into his business deals, his past, his many, many thousands of pages of litigation, his history as a sort of racial bomb thrower in New York in July. And part of the problem was his opponents did not see him as a serious person. A lot of sort of news outlets that typically amplify print coverage did not see him as a serious person. And so what would have happened in an ordinary campaign, if the stuff that the Times and other places published over the summer had been published about Mitt Romney, right, you would have seen the Rick Perry super PAC go up in Iowa and New Hampshire with $1 million a week in TV ads in every state, and that is what moves public opinion ultimately. But nobody even tried. So, I guess I do think the press has some stuff to answer for with Trump, but it's just not true that nobody even tried.
No, and to your point, I mean, you asked the question earlier, and to Alex's point about how you're starting to see the ramifications of a party telling its voters for a decade or more, don't trust those people.
Right.
So the Times, in particular, I would say was quite good at this. But one of Trump's enormous talents, which he honed over many years dealing with the New York Post and the Daily News. There's a great and very famous Pete Hamill line about how he stopped running Trump stories because Trump would call up and say he was a source close to Trump, and he didn't want to run these in the Daily News when he was the editor there. But Trump is very good at divide and conquer with the media. He is very good at sort of creating the sense of, I'm going to make you all chase a different breadcrumb, and I'm the breadcrumb.
But the other point to this is that I don't think it's any insult to the New York Times to say that the New York Times could run 5,500 pieces about how Trump failed here and here, and his voters would say, it's the New York Times, for God's sakes. The symbol of elitist, distant, rich guys, politically correct stuff. Why should we're not?
And by the way, that's the same thing Rubio tells his supporters,
Exactly.
right? And that's the same thing Ted Cruz tells his supporters.
Loudly.
So the sense I have from listening to you is you still think that a Clinton-Trump matchup is more likely than not to lead to a pretty significant victory for Clinton. My skepticism is only the black swan issue, that every once in a while something shows up. It could be a recession caused by the Chinese economy. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be a criminal referral, but put out the criminal referral, that under some circumstances, Clinton does not stand up well to exactly the kind of campaign that Trump would run. It's clearly high risk and he could crater. But the other side of that is, of all the Republican candidates, the one who could give her the most fits under circumstances is Trump. And the example, if I may be very blunt, is with the woman issue. Yes. She called him a misogynist. He wheeled right around within minutes or hours, and said, you're talking about misogyny when you enabled your husband, that sexual predator?
I would say two things on that. I mean, I was very struck the other night in the debate when she was asked about Trump. Both she and Sanders, incidentally, were both asked, do you think he is a racist? They both declined to swing at that pitch. They answered it a little differently and slightly offline. But she kept saying, I'm going to address him on policy. I don't want to get into the mud with him. And it was very clear that she's trying not to sort of poke the bear, because it is true that when he went after her and her husband, that stopped. Basically, she stopped using him as a foil in her speeches. However, I think that I would say the flip side of that is that, and so yes, she is a very much an color inside the lines politician, and he doesn't follow any normal rules, and that is going to, I think, get in her head. However, if you think that the Rick Lazio moment in 2000 of him walking up to her at the podium and saying "sign it" was a game changer, I think some of what Trump, and I'm not predicting, I'm just imagining a scenario here where you're at a general election debate and Trump will say something that will be sort of outlandish, and it will be to her benefit. I also think, and this has really not been looked at much at all, but BuzzFeed, which is run by our former colleague Ben Smith, has a kid who's been pulling all of the old audio tapes of Trump on Howard Stern, and some of the stuff that he says about women is
repellent,
pretty jarring. And I think if people think that's not going to basically just be run on a don't take our word for it, here's his words ad loop, they're kidding themselves.
Well, and we already know from the Republican primary that Trump actually has a hard time confronting a woman face to face. That there are very, very few Republicans who sort of profited from confrontation with Trump, and Carly Fiorina is one of them. When he made fun of her face and her voice, she threw it right back at him, and nobody, he didn't know what to do with that, because with a guy, he knows, just punch him right back even harder, and with her, it was a really different and confusing scenario for him.
That is definitely a point to file away. By the way, we're talking politics, but there is something beyond this election that I'm wondering about. So let's acknowledge that, well, there's two things. So you've got this toxic mix of legitimate grievance, economic hardship for white working class folks. They're the ones that Charles Murray and Tom Frank have been talking about. Basically have had no improvement in their income for, depending on how you measure it, 20 years or even longer. Whoever wins in November, I would posit the notion that there's not much government can do for these people. This is Tyler Cowen's argument, the Great Stagnation, that we were in an unusual time in America from World War II to the early 70s. We picked all the low-hanging fruit, and you can talk about job retraining, you can talk about tax breaks, that basically if you are an unskilled worker, you're not going to be in good shape. And the question is, from the political, assuming we get through this political season relatively intact, what happens a few years from now if this same cohort says, wait a minute, we raised our voices, we went to the polls, and nothing's changed? I mean, that does not strike me as particularly healthy for the system.
I have a friend who's a Republican who follows politics very closely, and he emailed me on Friday night as Chicago was churning out of control, which was this canceled Trump rally. And I said to him that he had been saying to me for months that he thought this election was actually going to be very similar to 1968, which is a point that has been made repeatedly, and lots of people, particularly Democratic strategists, will say that's not true. A lot of them are now acknowledging it looks much more like that than they had thought. But I said, you called this correctly, and he wrote back, well, the good news is that it'll look like this again in 2020. So I think that there is a very high chance, I mean, he just meant as a story, he didn't actually mean it was good news, but there is a very high chance that whoever wins the presidency is, let's say you could see a scenario where Hillary Clinton wins the White House and the Democrats retake the Senate.
By one vote.
Yes. You can see a scenario where Donald Trump wins the White House and the Republicans lose the Senate. A lot of these scenarios are possible. I don't think there is going to be a whole lot of governing effectiveness, especially out of this climate.
Well, and to your point about sort of the white working class, the Democrats are in a position where they feel more empowered than they ever have because they don't need the white working class anymore, right? That Mitt Romney, Stuart Stevens, Mitt Romney's sort of senior strategist from 2012, loves to point out, Mitt Romney won the white vote by a bigger margin than Reagan did when he won in a landslide in 1980, and he lost the election. And that sort of the demographic change driving that dynamic is only going to be magnified over the next few years. So what happens when you have this sort of population out there that already feels so underserved being even more marginalized because you have what looks to be a more durable
And that's
majority?
part of the thing about Hillary. I keep thinking, when you talked about them clearing the field, I'm thinking of somebody like Elizabeth Warren, or even more, frankly, like Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, strong labor roots, very angry about a lot of these deals, and has been for years. Who the idea that the Democrats walk away from the white working class, which was their base for going back to Andrew Jackson, is a little bit weird. The other question I would just throw out before I got one more question for you guys, and then I want to turn to the audience. I'm a little skeptical about the coalition of the ascendant. That's Ron Brownstein's notion that, we've got more blacks, more browns, more college-educated, more young, therefore we can lose the white working class. Just as one example, and maybe Trump is the answer to this. Our African Americans, in 2012, they turned out in higher percentage than whites for the first time ever. Call me madcap, but the idea of keeping the first African American president around may have had something to do with that. So the question is, Hillary will get 90% of the African American vote, but 90% of what? Millennials voted for Obama in lesser majorities in 2012 than in 2008 because I think in part they'd had a rough economic time of it. Do we really think Hillary Clinton is going to turn out millennials given how they're voting now? I mean, that's where I'm wondering whether that may be a fool's gamble.
No, it's very much of, look, I think she's running on the Obama coalition. That's the coalition that's available to her. So there's been lots of talk about how she's abandoning the Bill Clinton coalition of 92 and 96. She's not abandoning it. It sort of left the Democrats. It doesn't work that way anymore. But yes, look, you're speaking to a concern that her campaign has very deeply. This is why, for all of the risk that it entails of having Donald Trump as the nominee, if you're them, to all of the unknowns,
You want that?
they still think that he will be a reactive force that will help turn out a very large number of black voters and Hispanic voters.
For what it's worth, if I were her campaign, I'd want to run against Ted Cruz more. Only because I think it would be the first campaign entirely decided on the grounds that we don't want a total body part in the White House. I've never seen a candidate so despised by everybody he's known. This is unprecedented in American politics, as far as I can tell. His college roommate says, I would vote for anybody in the phone book against him, literally. I talked to people in the Bush campaign. They said they were ready, nobody wanted to go near him.
You mean the W.
The
campaign?
the GW campaign, yeah. I mean, it's a tribute to him in some way that he's gotten this far by embodying what was once said about another Texas senator, Phil Gramm. You know the line? Even his best friends can't stand him.
Right.
I mean, so I may be wrong about this, but I mean, if I were picking one of these people that I would want to run against.
To be clear, I think they actually would prefer to run against Cruz. I just don't think they believe that option is available to them anymore.
Let me ask you before we turn to this about the journey you both took, which is a little unusual, or at least seems to be unusual. We've seen all these people going from legacy media to websites, to blogs, to Snapchat, to Instagram, to wherever. You folks left a thriving website, Politico, to go to the Good Gray Lady. And so the question for me is, what's different about covering politics for the New York Times than for Politico?
I think where to start? I think probably the biggest thing, just coming right in on day one, is your audience is dramatically different, and you have to think about sort of covering the election and telling the story of a campaign for a group of people who are fascinated by news, but not necessarily hanging on every minute development.
Who won the hour,
news.
you mean?
Right. So, I think Politico did and does a lot of sort of high impact campaign reporting. I think that Politico never has to think about how to persuade its readers that this development in the campaign is important. And there's just a different level of writing and a different level of just sort of a different editorial sensibility that's required to go up to somebody who would be just as happy to read about, the French Museum and grab them by the lapels.
It just occurs to me, how many of you read the New York Times regularly? Wait. How many of you check in on Politico regularly?
That's pretty good.
That's more than I would have thought, actually. Alex is exactly right. Also, I just think that this election in particular, one of the things that the Times can do wonderfully well is very, very in-depth reporting and throw lots of resources at it. And Politico is less equipped to do that kind of a thing. And in an election that has had so many different candidates, and then two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, with such extensive backgrounds in various ways, it's been useful. It's funny, though, I was thinking when Alex was talking, one of the things that used to drive my father, who you mentioned earlier, crazy, was when I would sit at the dinner table and I would talk at length about intricacies of, XYZ happened with unknown aid, Joe Smith at City Hall, and don't you know what I'm talking about? And he would essentially say, this is not that interesting to normal people. And so the Politico audience does find that tremendously.
I don't.
Right, and thank you.
No,
Jeff.
no. I don't. I write for Politico for the magazine, but when I read some of the Senate Technology Committee's deputy staff director defects to.
That's more utilitarian than some of what I was.
I do think that one of the sort of essential editorial insights that Politico had at the start that is now pretty universally accepted is that even people who follow politics more casually want to be addressed as
Yes,
though they
absolutely
are
true.
really sophisticated about it, and
Absolutely
many
true.
of them are.
Yes.
You know, they don't necessarily know the name of the deputy staff director or whatever, but they don't want to be sort of condescended to and have the news sort of dumbed down, so to speak, to a easily digestible level. They want to read about sort of the intricacies of what's happening if you can make it interesting enough, if you can make it part of a larger story that's
Absolutely
interesting.
But as you say, by definition, if you're reading Politico, what you want is political news.
Right.
If you're reading the Times, you've got endlessly competing, interesting stories from around the world that are begging for space.
I think what Politico does, it does exceptionally well, and I think that it benefited both of us, but it is very different audiences.
I also noticed that, I mean, the Times investment into digital now is really quite something to see. It's really the idea that many of us need to read the paper because that's how we have to hear the thud of that paper on the doorstep, or in the case of the Sunday Times at Christmas, the crash of the Sunday Times, all those dead trees. But I think what it's doing digitally is, in that sense, there may be maybe less of a departure than simply thought. Let me turn. I just wanted to add this one thing, because it occurs to me when we talk about why the Trump voters or the prospective Trump voters may feel that sense of not just that they're believing enough, but betrayal by all these forces. Not the big shots on Wall Street, the politicians, the media, the Hollywood elite, who condescend to their life. If you drew a Venn diagram of the New York Times editorial page and the Wall Street Journal editorial page, as far as I can tell, they meet on only two issues: free trade and immigration. Wall Street Journal because they like cheap labor, the New York Times because they got to be politically correct on immigration. If you take the two things that now respectable economists have said have most hurt the American white working class, it's free trade and immigration.
I would add another thing to that list, not necessarily as a place, and certainly not as a place where the two editorial pages agree, but the other space that Trump is filling that is just anathema to elites is on foreign policy, that he does not accept the basic premise that the United States needs to be a sort of forward-leaning, basically aggressive global power. That you heard him using language in that last debate that could have been the McGovern campaign, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have enough money for Social Security and we have troops in Korea, and that's something that you would never hear from sort of quote-unquote respectable company in either party.
That's a good point.
One of the things, though, where you are seeing the dynamic between what Trump knows he should be doing and what he wants to say and what has been saying for a long time and what's gotten him to the dance is, in that same debate, he also had this line about how there should be 20,000 to 30,000 troops in Syria, which was sort of under-examined and jaw-dropping and very different and inconsistent with his other theory of the case. And that is where you can see he is getting some kind of foreign policy advice. They have now refused to release who their foreign policy, and promised to, and then missed those deadlines week after week after week. He is retaining some of it. It just doesn't seem to be in any kind of linear.
It goes beyond goes beyond secret plan for Vietnam, right?
Yes,
It's a secret plan
No,
drafted
I
by
understand.
secret
No,
people.
it's his foreign policy advisors are Colonel Sanders and General Motors. It's quite clear to me. Okay, let's turn to these questions. They're good ones, I think. Is there any way that Michael Bloomberg could have been a viable candidate, or did he just time it wrong?
I mean, what we saw from the Bloomberg operation when he chose not to run, they sort of showed their cards. This is what our polling said. There was a pretty compelling case that in a race between Sanders and Trump, there was a space there for somebody who was not perceived as a radical. He would have had a ton of money. He had secured, or almost secured, a running mate in Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This would have been a ticket in terms of its just governing credibility and stature light years ahead of where Ross Perot was, and he wouldn't have dropped out in the middle of the summer and then tried to get back in the race later. So you could see the scenario. It's just not the scenario that exists.
No, I agree. I mean, it's exactly right. It certainly doesn't exist now. Even then, you could see a case. I mean, I think my thing with it, having seen various Mike Bloomberg campaigns, is he's really not a good candidate. And running for president, even if you run a sort of all 50 state television campaign, which is a lot of what he would have done, there's just a sort of basic rhythms of politics, especially when you would pair him against Donald Trump, that would not favor him particularly well.
I could picture, though, Bloomberg turning to Trump and say, $8 million? Loser. Pathetic. Sad. Anyway, no, I think
might still, but
it just seemed to me that he said the same thing in 2007, that he looked at it, he could figure no way to do anything more than tying up the Electoral College.
the difference, I think, and this is part of why we looked at it and reported on it as extensively as we did, is that in 2007, I think it was largely the folly of some of his aides aimed at keeping him relevant. Remember, that was before the term limits tinkering that kept him in office in 2009. This time it was somewhat driven by them, but much more by him.
What do Ben Carson and Chris Christie have to gain by endorsing Trump?
They get to stand behind Donald Trump on stage, and while lots of cameras still go. If you're Chris Christie, I mean, I'm going to let Alex answer this, but my one thing on Christie is that a friend of Christie's said to me that a couple days after the endorsement, this is why you shouldn't make decisions when you're angry. And I think Chris Christie was enormously angry about all of this.
No, I think that kind of says it. The one thing I'd add on Christie, I mean, Carson, sort of who knows what is motivating him in politics these days. With Christie, that is a sort of get me out of Trenton kind of move, right? That he is clearly kind of done with that. Right. And the very fact that you had him sort of vacationing, I think in Florida near Trump's resorts, in a week when
my friend says,
transit might have been shut down.
Yeah. I've got a friend who's a wonderful writer, director, Andrew Bergman, who I think says that he's angling to be a casino greeter in Atlantic City. Although, given his personality, that might not work out so well, would it?
Depends. I was going to say depends.
Yeah, that's true. Will Obama get to appoint a Supreme Court justice?
I don't think so, but I could be wrong, and I'm reluctant to predict it.
I think you're right.
I think in a world where Trump is the nominee and it looks like Republicans are headed for a massacre in the Senate, that's the one window, right?
Really? That's an interesting notion.
Where if Republicans feel like we're not going to win the White House and we might lose the leverage we have in the Senate to, that's the only scenario where maybe they come back and say, can we, you were talking about that Republican governor of Nevada, could we get that one back on the table?
Okay. It just seems to me that, I remind people that, that after the 2000 election, one of the more prominent liberal law professors in America, Bruce Ackerman, wrote that because of the disputed nature of the 2000 election, the Senate should not confirm any Supreme Court nominee until 2004. So this is, to some extent, a sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Mm-hmm. The idea of no hearings, however, has taken it to yet another level.
Well, the scary thing that I hear from a lot of Democrats in particular, just remembering the Florida recount, is what if that unfolded in a world where there was a 4-4 Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Where's the country then?
Yeah.
Which is also, by the way, part of why Mike Bloomberg didn't run. He was afraid that it would get kicked in some way, and in a split court it would be a mess.
Will the Obama legacy help or hurt Hillary during a general election, should she be the nominee? I just footnote that by saying, there's sort of basic theory that one of the fundamentals that decides if a party keeps the White House is the approval rating of the outgoing president. He's now actually around 50%, I think.
I think that it helps her quite a bit, and I certainly think it has helped her in the lead up to South Carolina, for instance, which she won overwhelmingly. He all but endorsed her in an interview with Politico. He's reluctant to do that now openly, but to your point about how she has to reassemble the Obama coalition and get enormous turnout, yes, I think it is ultimately a help to her. I think that there is the white working class base that is gravitating toward Donald Trump is going to, I think, do that, if Donald Trump is the nominee, do that regardless.
What's worse for the Republicans, Trump as the nominee or a brokered, contested, whatever convention?
This is sort of,
it's like...
Lindsey Graham had this great line when he was asked last fall whether he would rather have Ted Cruz or Donald Trump as the nominee. He said, "This kind of like asking me, would you rather be shot or poisoned?"
That's right.
Right, that there's not a good option there. But this is the conversation that's happening in the Republican elite right now, and there are a lot of folks who say contested convention destroys the party. You'd see Cleveland in ruins if you denied Trump, like literally, if you denied Trump the nomination. And then there's another view, and I think this is the one that's sort of on the ascendant track, that Trump is such a toxic figure and so unprecedented and so outside what's sort of the normal mainstream, that if the party doesn't do everything within its power to stop him, it becomes for a generation the party of Donald Trump. And I remember hearing 10 and 15 years after Pat Buchanan's convention speech in '92, that awful party put that man on stage, but they didn't nominate him.
There was a theory among some elites for a while that we could co-opt Trump. Trump would be better than Cruz for us
Right.
because
The deal maker.
well, not just deal maker, but we can explain him away. Cruz is actually a Republican. He came up through the Republican Party. They felt as if he would own the brand in a very different way. I think Alex is very right, and lots of things have transpired since that view was held. Remember, we're talking about a Republican Party frontrunner who last night at a rally declared, unsubstantiated, that a protester who had rushed at the stage at an earlier rally was ISIS related. I mean, this is unheard of, the kinds of things that he is saying. And the more that the party is hearing things like that, the more concerned they get.
Yeah, and that's the part that still puzzles me about people like Bill Bennett, who are, wrote the Book of Virtues, former education secretary. His whole theme was, the guardrails came off in the 60s, virtues, that even the prospect of a loss in a Supreme Court nominee, how that counterbalances the deepest things he and folks like him have said about why we need a conservative government. What's the danger of losing the guardrails? And then turning to a guy like Trump, it frankly puzzles me, because to me the argument has almost nothing to do with politics at all. It's nothing to do with policies or whether you're going to get a tax rate of what, or it's the nature of the presidency put in the hands of someone. Like what I said about Hillary, I don't think Trump thinks he lies. I think he believes what he says when he says it. You know him. Do you think I am right or am I wrong?
No, I think that I don't know.
Okay.
I think we put Trump on the couch about as much as we're going to today, but in our story. But I do think that there are times where I certainly think he doesn't realize what he has said. To your point about the party sort of adopting him, though, there is this group of Republicans that believes that they are going to educate him. There are some people who think he's moldable. If we get hold of him, we can control this. I mean, Trump has so far proven singularly uninterested in surrounding himself with people who can tell him no.
Well, here's a little thing from the cutting room floor of our story today that, for folks who think that they're going to educate Donald Trump, that there was this episode in the 2012 election where a couple Republicans from Washington went up to Trump Tower to meet with him and talk to him about sort of how to communicate effectively in the media, Mr. Trump. And they go up with...
It was for the Republican convention, right?
It was after it was clear that Romney was going to be the nominee, Trump wasn't running, and they get up, and by all accounts, what he wanted to talk to them about, and Maggie can sort of fill in the rest, was he wanted to talk about his tie collection.
Yeah,
and
literally.
show them his fabulous tie collection.
Yes.
This is my tie brand. So not interested in being educated.
There were two actually components to that. One was that the first person who was looked at to do the media training was Ari Fleischer, and it was going to cost a lot more money, and nobody wanted to pay, and Trump
Least of all Trump.
Trump didn't want to pay. And yes, then it was essentially his response to people who were trying to tell him what to do was, yeah, I got it. Did you see my ties? And then he went off on sort of his list of grievances. Chuck Todd is terrible, and this, and the president, and this is essentially what a conversation with him is.
That's my picture. Yeah.
Well,
that's exactly, and he's done remarkably.
Yes, he has.
Well.
Well, one thing we haven't said here is that, for all of the things that we are talking about, and for all of the sort of dangerous things that he has said that got really overlooked, I did a piece with one of our colleagues, Patrick Healy, last fall, where we looked at a week of the words that he was saying, literally every single word, every speech, every interview, and looked at the common themes. But he's exceptionally charming and funny and entertaining. So there are people will compare him to George Wallace, but it's not sour. It's smiling and fun.
Some conservative covered him last one and said this is he's a genuine comedian. He's really funny. He riffs.
This is one of the things that when people do the sort of finger wagging at the media, I think what we all need to, and really everybody needs to think about as they sort of recoil from the violence at rallies or certain of the ideas he's advanced, there is really nobody who has not at some point or another watched a Trump speech, watched him at a debate, and laughed out loud, right?
Yeah.
Because he can deliver a line.
Exactly
and even
right.
if he's repugnant to what you believe in, I know plenty of Democrats who found his sort of going off on Marco Rubio, as little Marco, to be totally hilarious.
Yes, absolutely.
This question comes from Joe at NYT. Just letting you know. I'm not identifying him. You might know who he is. I have no idea. We're at a stage in the campaign where emboldened racists are organizing around Trump. In your estimation, what does an antidote to this uprising look like? And will the Democratic National Committee's failure to unify ultimately prevent them from confronting Trump?
That's a tough question. I think that the Democratic National Convention or the party itself, post-primaries, I think will probably unify more easily than the Republicans will, because I think Hillary Clinton will move to name a vice presidential pick who can appeal to the Sanders coalition, and I think she will be mindful of it. And I think Hillary Clinton has spent many months having sort of back-channel conversations with Elizabeth Warren, and I think that's where this will play some role.
Yeah, there's an allied question about whether or not there's going to be any problem with Sanders supporters not getting behind Hillary. I do think Donald Trump fixed that. Now, by the way, it's kind of interesting, given the vulgarity of the Trump campaign. I can't say it, but have you seen the button that is being sold at Sanders rallies? It's Hillary's symbol. The second word is her. The first word is a verb.
That's subtle.
And I'm shocked. I mean, I really was, because what it speaks to is that the kind of more vulgar anger, at least it may not be at the same level that Trump rallies, but that's a sign that there's some kind of something beyond just political opposition there. That's pretty nasty.
I think that I think it speaks to just. I think that there is a lot of anger there. I think there's a lot of anger at her. I think there's some historical anger at sort of seeing the Clintons as avatars of Wall Street excess for a lot of Sanders supporters. But I also, what it goes to is just, again, this point that we were talking about earlier, where Sanders throughout much of the campaign presented this persona of, I don't want to do negative campaigning. I won't air a negative ad. I'll only do it if she does it. There is stuff he could be tamping down that he is not tamping down.
This is one of those ridiculous questions that I would only ask here or at a bar late at night in a
Well, they're
campaign.
the same, so I understand that.
Could somebody other than Bernie Sanders have actually taken Hillary on as a Democratic opponent?
We've talked about this between the two of us so many times, and when you look at the reasons why people didn't run against her, in a lot of ways the most formidable Democrats in the party, other than Hillary Clinton, would be Joe Biden and Jerry Brown, right? Many term governor of California. And the knock on them was they're too white and they're too old, right? And who knew that you couldn't be white or old enough?
Nothing wrong with that.
Well, I actually think more seriously that there's another aspect to this. I talked to a dear friend of mine who lost a son to illness. And he's a very experienced political observer, and he said there's absolutely no doubt in his mind why Joe Biden didn't run. Because this friend of mine said, there are days when you can get up and work, and there are days when you're paralyzed, and you can't run for president that way. You just can't. And that's a case where I think what Biden said to, I guess, Colbert was, there's nothing more to be said by that. And I guess, and you're right, a 61-year-old Jerry Brown might have been a somewhat different. It is interesting also that when you look at where the young talent is, it's not spread evenly among the two parties. I mean, say what you will about the Republican candidates, but Rubio, Cruz are in their 40s. You've got a deep bench of young. Paul Ryan is what? Not yet 50. He's 50, not close.
No, he's not much older than me.
And the Democrats, it looks like they'll be mall walking, before the early bird dinner. I mean, it's
the thing that I would say, though, to your question about A, who could have taken her on, and B, younger voter concern. I do think there was a lot of energy around Hillary in terms of the clearing of the field. Yeah. There was a lot of energy for her out of the 2012 election. Right after President Obama won re-election, there was an enormous feeling of vindication among Democrats for many reasons, and they believed that she was going to be the best possible option to keep the White House. And I think that some combination of the email issue, which I really, I know we have not talked about it that much, and I have no desire to talk about the legal aspect of it, but just from the political element of it and the psychic element of it, I think it really set her back to a very dark place in terms of Clinton-era investigations and sort of a feeling of being persecuted. And And I think that prior to that, I think in 2014, she decided she was going to go give a lot of speeches because she knew she was going to be running, and she squandered a lot of time.
That, I have to tell you, that it's beyond me. When she said, first she said, well, that's what they offered.
Right.
Now, let me tell you something.
That was not a good moment.
I have, not quite at her level, given speeches. That's not how it works.
Right.
They don't call you and say, here's what we're offering. They say, we'd like you to speak, and your lecture agent says, here's what we charge.
Will you release the transcripts?
Yes, I will.
Question.
I will. As long as everybody else does, which is another, that's the other line. Yes, everybody else who was making $250,000 for an hour speech and who was the logical next president of the United States.
Yes.
Because one of the things she said was, well, I didn't know I was going to be running for president then.
Well,
Does any sentient human being, does any smart primate believe that as an answer? And maybe that goes to what you're saying. It is beyond me how, you know, constantly with someone who has played at the highest levels of politics, like the thing with Nancy Reagan being starting a conversation about AIDS.
Yeah.
Unnecessary.
Well, but there's two different things there, I would say. One is that I think that she makes a lot of mistakes. Just as a politician, just as a political performer, she is pretty gaffe prone, and she always has been.
Yeah.
This is just not something that has much improved. That's what the Nancy Reagan thing was something strange. I don't think that was intentional. Her
No, I agree.
aides were very clear. She was tired. She had been distracted by something. There were all these reasons, but. In terms of I'm going to go give a lot of speeches, and that's like a year-long gaffe. I mean, so that I think is very different. And
the problem is that the honest answer she could give, which is the same answer at a much different level than I would give, there is no easier way to make a lot of money.
Sure.
It's not a crime. It's not a conflict. No,
I would make the argument, though. I mean, to your point, yes, that is the honest answer.
but you can't give it.
Where you can, Donald Trump is a plutocrat who has made himself seem oppressed. So, and part of the way he has done that is by virtue of saying, yes, I'm really rich. Look at all my money.
Yeah.
And so you can either decide you want to go make a lot of money, or you're not going to do that and you're going to run for president and talk about Wall Street excess, but it's very hard to do both, and she has tried doing both, and that, I think, is the problem.
Last question. Election day is what, November 3rd? Do you happen to know?
You say so.
Let's say it's November
first
3rd.
Tuesday.
Yeah.
What are you going to do November 4th and 5th?
Sleep. See my children.
We're gonna go cover the recount. And
Exactly. Not me.
Can't top that. Thank you both for being here, and get off my lawn.
Thanks so much.